I'd also kind of hit a roadblock with Up to the Mountains, and so I felt like I needed to work on something new. So I really did start this book 10 years ago, but I think I've only been writing it for much shorter than that. But this paragraph has not really changed over those 10 years. I think one sentence is different through all the revisions, just to give you a glimpse into my head at that time. Then there was the time you worked for your friends, Sam and Paul in Changsha, and they rented you an apartment in the heart of the city next to the river and the bars. You did not call home once that year, given everything that had happened, and by the time you decided to move back again, everything had changed. It was your second sojourn in China, and the experience was much different than the first. But all that mattered was that it was different, and other than that, you did not care. You lived comfortably and belonged to no one. Your sense of purpose was finally clear. You were seldom lonely and never self-conscious. You felt important. Things were good. So right away when I look back on that opening, it's clear to me at least that there's a blend of fact and fiction. Obviously, my circumstances for being in China at the time were very similar to the main character, Cole. But that line, you did not call home once that year, given everything that had happened. And by the time you decided to move back again, everything had changed. I really didn't know what that meant at the time. I just thought, that sounds mysterious and interesting and cool. And I had just been in graduate school studying creative writing and really thinking about how to hook readers and how to set up the opening of a book. And so I knew, I'm just gonna put that there and see what happens, and hopefully that will serve as a guidepost moving forward. And in Up to the Mountains and Down to the Countryside, I had used an alternating chapter structure to, kind of give me a way forward. And I thought that worked well. So what I did in this book was, instead of alternating between characters, whereas in the first book it was the protagonist and the antagonist kind of coming closer together at the beginning and then coming into conflict, I wanted to make this one more about location and China and America. And that was actually something I tried to do in the first book. Originally, Thomas Guillard, who was the antagonist of that book, was the main character. And I had envisioned chapters alternating in this way between his life in China and his life back in Minnesota. But it was very drastically departing from my own experience, and I was just starting out as a writer, and at the time nothing felt convincing or real enough to me to keep. And so that's when I abandoned that, but was able to find my way back to it here. And I think what's interesting in this book is that there is no clear difference between protagonist and antagonist. Cole, the main character, is both in this book. And what I ended up doing in the America chapters is showing him from the perspectives of other characters around him. So the China chapters are from his point of view looking back in time. And then the American chapters take place 1 year later, but each chapter is from the perspective of someone in his immediate orbit. Friends, family, acquaintances, not so much friends, but just people passing by him. So this second excerpt is from the second chapter, and this is from the point of view of his brother Abraham, and it takes place right here in San Francisco. In the pre-dawn darkness of his apartment, Abraham made his way across the living room, where his brother lay sleeping, and into the kitchen. He felt for the light switch. When the light came on, he closed his eyes and shook his head. The doors on several of the cabinets had been left open, and there was a silicone ice cube mold on the counter that had yet to be refilled. He attended to them, then turned on the Keurig, then rubbed his eyeballs with his knuckles and opened the fridge. No creamer left, but the carton was still there. He went to the garbage can beneath the sink to throw it away and came across a wad of tissues on top of the trash. They lived in San Francisco, and though it had been cool and foggy recently, neither he nor Lola was sick. Frowning in revulsion, he looked at his brother. Neither was Cole. He made a cup of coffee and then opened his laptop and loaded the news. The reports had mostly to do with the upcoming presidential election, even though it was still nearly a year and a half off. Terror in the Middle East, Black Lives Matter, an explosion in a place called Tianjin. Abraham clicked on the link to read more, then referenced a map of China in a separate tab, trying to determine how close the city was to Changsha, where Cole had been living the year before. Not very was the answer. He emptied his mug and placed it in the sink. There were several dishes and bowls there, along with a note that read, "Please wash." It had been sitting there unanswered for days now. Abraham sighed and switched off the light. Cole had been living with them since returning from China, crashing on their sofa while he edited his memoir. And even though they were brothers and Abraham loved him, he was starting to outstay his welcome. He woke up late and ate everything in the fridge and contributed next to nothing in the way of rent. His only income being the 3 or 4 translation assignments he would take each month on Craigslist, and then for the most part blow in pot. He smoked all day and worked all night, rarely, if ever, leaving the house, making extensive use of their cable account to rewatch entire seasons of shows at once. A scraggly wino's beard had returned to his face, and he would sit there most nights, picking at it on the couch, considering the hairs individually as if they were treasures to be beheld, and occasionally putting them into his mouth. It was a habit he had had for almost as long as his brother could remember, but Abraham was past the point of trying to convince him to stop. By now, he was who he was. Abraham just wished that he could be it somewhere else. So before I go on, I just want to say how awesome it is to have audience reaction. I can't tell you how many times I've read this. So I wrote about half the book this way, just kind of plowing forward, alternating between the China and US chapters, the year before, the year after. But at a certain point, I got to a stopping point where I didn't know where to take it. I didn't know how to complete the narrative arc. I didn't know how to make it something worth reading that said something. And around this time, 2 things happened. The first was I read a short story called Cat Person. I don't know if anyone has read that. It went viral back in 2017, so I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. It was published in the New Yorker originally, and it's now out as a collection of short stories by Anna Rupanian, I believe. And amazing story. It kind of details a young woman's brief relationship with an older man, and just takes an unflinching, almost clinical look at modern dating and male fragility. And the second thing that happened was I had several people close to me read the initial chapters of this draft. And I got some pretty consistent feedback that I needed to look a little closer at the way I was portraying women, both through the eyes of Cole and also when I was using them as narrators for the America chapters. The feedback wasn't that it was problematic, it was just that it was lazy, to be completely honest. And so those 2 things together forced me to really reflect a little bit more, think about what was it potentially that I wanted to say, especially as a male author, if I was going to talk about something along the lines of this issue. And really what I came away with was this idea that a lot of times the subtle little things add up and they matter. And that's where I ended up taking this book. And it seemed like direction that I could write that felt honest and not overly melodramatic or anything like that. So this third excerpt and final excerpt is from the third chapter, but it's one of the last things I wrote when I came back to the first draft and started to revise with this premise in mind. This isn't the opening of the chapter like the last two, so just to set the scene a little bit, Cole is in a bar in Changsha where his friends and employers have staged a surprise party for him to celebrate his first month of work at their company. And again, this is kind of like foreshadowing those subtle, smaller things that are going to become an issue later in the book. So I just want to preface this by saying it is a little uncomfortable to listen to certain parts of this, but this is how I kind of found direction moving forward in the book. You continued drinking and toasted again. The brothers Lee came over once they'd shut down the bar and ordered xiaoye from across the street. Lotus root, mushrooms, beef skewers, leek. Sam and Paul tried to go Dutch, but were immediately dismissed by the two and told to eat. And after a while, the five of you moved over to join the rest of the group at Dice. By then, Qin Yan was falling all over herself, and you spoke to her kindly and bought her a drink. The first time you'd interacted for more than a handful of sentences regarded something not strictly related to work. Once the bid came to you, she considered her hand and called bullshit, belligerently slurring her words. And even though she was wrong and had to drink, she refused to deviate from the strategy over the next few rounds. Eventually, you found the courage to mix things up and hazard a bluff. And when she attempted to call you out on it again, you just smiled, asking if she was sure. By that point, didn't you realize that you never lied to girls? The brothers laughed. Yusheng groaned. Paul told you to get a room. Qing Yan turned beet red and consulted her hand once more, and before you knew it, you were saying to the rest of the table that you wouldn't be opposed. The four Chinese erupted like schoolchildren. In time, she regained her composure, refocusing on the game, but you could already tell that her confidence was shattered. There was no way in hell she was going to see it through. 14 sixes, she finally offered. Li Wendong was next and immediately uncovered his dice. It wasn't even close. She moaned in despair and finished her drink. Yusheng and Fei Fei began bugging you to show them what you had, but you just sat there and studied your beer, responding phlegmatically in Mandarin that a gentleman never told. Before you could muck your hand, however, Yusheng reached across the table and removed the lid. Qing Yan hit you and shouted angrily when she saw the dice, cursing her luck again, and it was then that you noticed Sam grinning at you, pumping his elbows and thrusting his hips in a crude pantomime of sex. You couldn't help but smile. Still, you tried to get him to knock it off, pelting him with your dice. You left with Sam and Paul at 4 a.m, saying goodbye to your friends from school. Li Wendong standing at the mouth of the alley with both of his hands raised. You had tried to get Qing Yan to go back to your place with you for a drink, but she'd been too tired and gone home drunk, falling down the stairs like a wrecking ball in the arms of Yusheng. You didn't care. By then it was more or less clear that he was interested in men. You staggered down Laodonglu like the drunkards that you were and slapped hands and hugged beneath a clover leaf at the intersection of Wui Avenue, where the city's homeless and migrant workers could be seen camped in boxes against the walls. Once you were on your own, you scolded yourself for staying out so late, but reflected on what you knew. Life was good to you in China. You were maybe a little reckless, but you were in your 20s, what can you say? You weren't hurting anyone. Your friends back home never would have treated you so well.